of course, want to travel safely. That's why today we are here to ask what can single states, what can the European Commission, what can the G20 do to ensure that in the near future people will take a plane, I repeat, safely, without the fear of COVID. What can airlines do to help airports in doing so, and vice versa, and which are the best practices on the ground? So I don't want to steal time to our speakers, and it's my pleasure to introduce the organizers of this webinar, Angela Natale, Managing Director of Boeing for Southern Europe, and Ferdinando Nelli Feroci, President of the International Affairs Institute. Ambassador Nelli Feroci, you have the floor.
Thank you, Frediano, and thank you for having accepted our invitation to moderate this seminar. My name is Ferdinando Nelli Feroci. I'm the President of the Istituto Affari Internazionali, and I'm very pleased to welcome all you at this online roundtable on the question of safety of air travel and measures that are needed to relaunch tourism. The two things are rather interlinked, and I'm also glad that this event has been organized with the collaboration and support of Boeing Italia, which I thank for this collaboration. This event is also part of the proceedings of the T20. T20 is an engagement group which supports and follows the activities of the G20. It's an engagement group composed of a network of think tanks around the world that operates by providing analysis, inputs, and also policy recommendations to the G20. And we have thought that since these two subjects, safety of air travel and restart of tourism, are part of the agenda of the G20, it might have been useful to engage one of our task force of the G20 on this very subject. Now, we are discussing the two subjects for one very simple reason. We know that COVID-19 has had tremendous, devastating consequences on all economies of the world, practically, but it has had a especially serious effect on the sectors of mobility, transport in general, air transport in particular, and tourism as a consequence. So we can easily say that both air transport and tourism are among the major victims of COVID-19, among the most seriously affected sectors of our economies that have been hit by COVID-19 and by the restrictions on mobility that have been adopted to contain contagions. The figures that witness the seriousness of the impact of COVID-19 on both air travel and tourism are quite impressive. I mean, for instance, I would give you just an idea. According to IATA preliminary statistics, the total losses of revenue for the air sector is calculated at around $118 billion only for the year 2020. And the overall fall in demand is calculated around 65.9% if compared to the previous year, 2019. And if one looks at the sector of tourism, the situation is even worse. Again, according to preliminary data that have been published by the World Tourism Organization, UNTWO, tourism suffered a reduction of around 74% of arrivals if compared to 2019, which is equivalent to a reduction of, in terms of arrival, almost 1 billion. And in terms of losses of jobs, it is calculated something between 100 to 120 million. So it's a very serious impact on the sector of tourism, which is particularly worrying if one considers the contribution of tourism to the GDP, to total GDP. Figures related to year 2019 the estimate were that tourism contributed for about 4.3% of total GDP worldwide, of total 6.8% of total investment, 28.3 points of total exports, and with a workforce of around 330 million people working in the sector of tourism in general. So if one looks at these figures, the impact is very, very worrying and very serious. Now, there are good prospects of a restart of both air travel and tourism if the situation improves, and it seems to be improving these days, if the vaccination continues around the world, and if the spread of contagion is contained. And this is why we have thought that it would be useful to have this webinar on the measures that can be adopted, are in part already being adopted to improve the safety of air travel, thus contributing to a restart of tourism worldwide. Some of these measures are already being implemented, both inside the airplanes, in the airports, through sanitation of airplanes and airports, through vaccination, of course, through testing, and more measure will hopefully, possibly be adopted with the adoption of sanitary passports, some forms of sanitary passports in the near future. So these are my very preliminary considerations. Let me once more thank Mrs. Angela Natale in Boeing Italia for their collaboration. Thank to Paolo Toschi, diplomatic advisor to the Minister of Tourism, who will intervene on his behalf. To all the panelists that will take part in this webinar, and finally to Frediano Finucci for his moderation. Frediano, the floor is back to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador. Really tremendous figures concerning the impact of COVID-19, you said rightly, on tourism and transport. So let's go to the transport with Angela Natale, one of the organizers of this webinar. Angela Natale is Managing Director of Boeing in Southern Europe. Mrs. Natale, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Frediano. And first of all, Mr. Toschi and IAI President Ambassador Nelli Feroci, dear speakers, moderator, thank you for being here with us today. And thank you as well to the so many of you who are following via streaming. As Boeing, we are particularly honored to have co-promoted together with the prestigious Istituto Affari Internazionali this T20 related event on the safe reopening of international travel to support the tourism, our economy, a topic that we believe should be prominent in any main political fora as the G20, this year, as you know, under the Italian presidency. A G20 that has committed to three fundamental values: planet, people, and prosperity. And today we will hear about how private companies can successfully collaborate with government. First of all, by putting at the service of all the relevant decision makers their expertise, their capabilities, their means of research, in order to focus and work all together on these pillars. Our objective today is clear: to promote a constructive dialogue on how to resume international air travel in a safe environment. International air travel means sustaining tourism, a fundamental driver of economic growth for all countries, and for Italy in particular. According to IATA Economics, the 2021 summer air travel will be closer to home versus summer 2019. North American tourists have booked travel more within the region, and the same for the Middle East region, while the share of tourism coming to Europe is declining. In the USA, where the vaccination rollout is proceeding fast and travel restriction has been eased, bookings are gradually improving. The pandemic that has hit us globally has forced us to change habits and to rethink procedures, and tools to manage the virus. The aviation sector, as it happened before, for different reasons, and I'm thinking to the post 9/11 terrorism threat, was able to quickly adjust to this new challenge and to leverage everything that was done till now by finding solutions to adapt to a changing environment, continuing on delivering its mission, help people and good travel in a safe manner. Our guest speakers in a little while will describe how they have successfully implemented new measures and procedures to reduce drastically the risk of the virus transmission while traveling by air. Boeing immediately took action at the outbreak of the pandemic, launching the Confident Travel Initiative, capitalizing on its engineering earth. This initiative, as we will be discussing more later in the technical session of this webinar, has focused on minimizing air travel health risk, driving awareness of existing health safeguards, peculiarity of the cabin environment, cleaning and disinfection process. At the same time, developing and testing new solutions like the UV wand technology, which is the ultraviolet light, a portable UV wand designed to sanitize airplane interiors. We have been able to show that sitting on an airplane next to another passenger is indeed equivalent to 7 feet of distance in outer space due to the airflow and the cabin environment. We have been then focusing on testing and screening procedure to compare the efficacy of several different passenger screening strategies for air travel, to show that indeed the screening protocol, some of which may involve a short quarantine period of no more than 4 or 5 days, can be equally or more effective than quarantine-only protocol up to 14 days in mitigating the spread of COVID-19. And from what we can understand from scientists and researchers, the COVID-19 will be not the only pandemic of this kind, unfortunately. And so it is essential for the world to continue to prosper, to find a way to coexist with this new threat containing to a minimum any risk. In this view, we think that protocol should be harmonized and based on a data-driven, risk-based approach in order to establish a global framework which encourages safe travel between countries. Once again, this solution can only be found if we act together. I mean, country, public sector, private industry, think tanks, research center, and universities. From our side, we are ready and happy to provide all our experience, capabilities, research, analysis to support a scientific database discussion that now will start. And thank you again to all of you.
Thank you, Mrs. Natali. You raised many issues, many questions that will be addressed in the second part of our webinar with technical experts. Floor to the diplomatic advisor of the Italian Minister of Tourism, Massimo Garavaglia. The minister is busy, unfortunately, so Mr. TOSCHI will say a few words on behalf of the minister. I'd like that he chairs the working group on tourism of G20 under the ongoing Italian presidency. Mr. TOSCHI, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Buongiorno, buon pomeriggio. It's a beautiful spring day in Rome, and spring gives us a sense of hope and opening, as some of you indicated already. At the same time, we cannot be complacent. So it's a great pleasure to convey to you a message from the Minister of Tourism, Massimo Garavaglia. Unfortunately, he is currently held up by a political engagement, but he really cared about this opportunity to address the industry, some of the stakeholders. And so I'm happy to present a few remarks from his side, from myself as diplomatic advisor to the minister, and as the moderator recalled, chair of the G20 working group on tourism this year. Let me give a shout out to Ambassador Nelli Feroci, President of the Istituto Affari Internazionali. Thank you for convening us. And thank you to Boeing, to Angela Natale, for helping us putting this opportunity of dialogue together, and for the role that the industry plays, which is obviously crucial. Also, let me say thanks to one of the engagements group that we're happy to work with in the G20 framework, the T20, the Think 20, a great opportunity for all of the G20 governments to be in touch with our friends and counterparts in the think tank community. So today, we all focus on something that is crucial, not only for the tourism and travel industry. We feel at the Ministry of Tourism that air travel is crucial to reopening our economies, and it has a very wide impact on our economies and on our societies, and so it deserves all of our attention. Ambassador Nelli Feroci mentioned some of the numbers that are associated with travel and tourism around the world, and I think a good sum up is that around 1 in 10 jobs around the world is actually connected to this sector. So this gives us a staggering image of how crucial this aggregated factor of our GDPs is. Minister Garavaglia will chair on May the 4th the meeting of the ministers of tourism of the G20 countries, which is an endeavor that has been made very crucial, very pertinent, and very timely by the pandemic crisis. It could have been before as well, but the pandemic, as you all already illustrated, really showed how this sector, which shrunk so dramatically and rapidly because of the crisis, is essential to the well-being of our economies. And the G20 really represents the appropriate forum for a conversation of this kind, being the premier international forum for economic coordination. So the G20 ministers are approaching a set of guidelines that the Italian chairmanship is putting forward, and that we have identified working along with our partners at the OECD and in the membership. These guidelines really represent a way forward, charting what we feel is the future of the tourism industry and the future of tourism. And they try and give a sense of how a future tourism would look like if we are successful in making it resilient, in making it sustainable, and in making it inclusive. In this framework, we have 7 priorities that address all the priorities that we feel are crucial. I won't go over the whole list, but I just want to say in this framework that safe mobility is our #1 priority. It is the one that the ministers on May 4th will discuss first, together, trying to encourage steps ahead. And in I would say in great deal of alignment with what has been mentioned by the first speakers, the key word here is to find international coordination and uniformity and harmonization if possible. So Italy is proposing to the G20 a commitment to support, to complement, and to coordinate with initiatives that are being born as we speak globally to ensure that safe mobility is back. Some of them were mentioned, some of them are crucial in the European space, and they're being discussed as we speak. You all know about the efforts that we're undertaking to develop a green digital certificate, which will allow for a resumption of safe mobility within the EU. It's a crucial document for the industry and beyond. Other proposals currently being developed involve the OECD, ICAO, which I'm sure the air industry is following very, very closely, and the WHO is also developing a platform. So the G20 is the ideal platform where these initiatives can be empowered, underlined, and the members of the G20, the members of the largest economies, can embrace them and sort of project them as an ideal future scenario where harmonization among different standards prevail. let me add one element to the conversation that we're having at the European level, which is that, of course, we're now focusing on the resumption of safe mobility within the EU, but we're also very interested, and the industry is extremely dependent upon the ability to welcome incoming travelers from outside of the European Union as well. You might have heard words from President von der Leyen even today in this respect, and she discussed the ability to use some of these initiatives in an interoperable way, which is a very technical word for exchanging information and operability with the United States, clearly a crucial market for Europe and for Italy. And we hope that similar conversations will continue with other important markets outside of the EU. Let me give you a brief sense of the kind of actions that Minister Garavaglia is advocating as chair of the G20 Ministers of Tourism. First of all, we want to work with the industry, and so this opportunity is particularly welcome, on developing better information sharing platforms and providing ultimately better information to the traveler. So authorities, institutions, and the industry are already making great strides. This is a great opportunity to develop advanced platforms to improve the information sharing technology that we have and make it accessible to the public. Second, we want to work on common international approaches to health information about the passenger, including the certification of the health status and information sharing. This is, of course, very delicate subject. It entails, in particular, a competence of health authorities nationally and at international level. So from the Minister of Tourism side, what we are representing is the appetite of the industry, the will of the industry to come to progress. And we are participating in this conversation, I would say, with a lot of determination, with a lot of hope that these dialogues can progress. Thirdly, as chair, we are promoting the use of digital traveler identity, of biometrics, and of contactless transactions. These are all tools you in the industry are very familiar with. These are tools that facilitate safe mobility, that can allow us to make great strides in improving and advancing safe mobility standards, and we are fully behind as G20 chair to finding common solutions. All of this work, lastly, I need to underline, as chair, we want to make sure is done respecting standards that are crucial to the rule of law and to what we do as a community. First and foremost, I mention it again, I will mention it, safety, health safety in particular. Second, privacy. We have different privacy standards across the G20 board. We want them to be represented and present in this conversation. And then in the EU context, of course, a specific instance, but crucial, of course, to Italy as a founding member of the EU and the leader of many of these conversations, the freedom of movement of people, clearly one of the pillars of our action in the EU framework. And I'm happy to share these considerations with Ambassador Nelli Feroci, who really charted the course of our action in Brussels for a long time. So all of these lines of work that I briefly outlined in the G20 work have a common thread, which is restoring consumers' confidence, and which is in the industry, you know this extremely well, and Boeing pointed to some of the data already showing more optimism. This is crucial in reopening the industry and giving us positive data. And I want to assure you there's no need to convince the Ministry of Tourism that air transportation is vital for the industry. We're fully aware. We're familiar with some of the stats that have been mentioned. We know, for instance, that just before the pandemic, the number of international tourist arrivals was growing significantly from 1.4 billion in 18 to 1.46 in 19, and more than half of those chose to travel by air. In Italy, over 65% of the travel packages in 19 included long-haul air travel outside of Schengen. So this gives you a sense of how prominent this dimension is only in the Italian market. So we're really committed to work with you in the industry, with all the stakeholders to make progress. And only agreeing on internationally recognized standards can we really improve. Let me mention one element in closing, which is that in the G20 framework and as action of this government under the Draghi leadership, green transition is really a primary element of our agenda. And so green transition in the travel and tourism sector is part of that framework. We know that the industry is extremely aware and alert to this. I want to underline how important this is. In the G20 space, we are going to continue referring to the Paris Agreement. We're continue to referring to the responsibilities that public authorities, the industry, and stakeholders undertook already in Paris and continue to undertake. And one of the frameworks that are crucial to it is the UN framework. And as you know, probably this is a crucial year for the UN coordination in that space with COP26, which Italy is co-chairing with our British friends. So a rich, very complex, but positively evolving scenario. On behalf of Minister Garavaglia, I want to thank you all for devoting your time and your energy to it. I want to underline that Minister Garavaglia, the Ministry of Tourism in Italy are fully behind this work, and they will continue being committed. You can count on us. Italy is doing its part, and we're thankful for opportunities like these to engage. Thank you very much. Grazie molto.
Thank you, Mr. Toschi, for your very interesting insights, and good luck for your task in the G20 session. So before switching to the core part of our webinar, which is divided in two, I'd like to remind to our viewers that there is the possibility to make questions that will be answered at the end of the second session, so approximately 4:45 p.m. Italian or Brussels time. It depends where you are located. And there is just one question from Muna Abu Sulayman. I think I probably did not correctly pronounce this name, but anyway, Mrs. Muna, please be patient, because we will collect many questions for our speakers, and we will answer, as I said, at 4:45 p.m. Italian or Brussels time. So let's go to the first part of this webinar. Let me introduce our panelist, Paola Testori Coggi, leader, co-chair of the T20 Task Force on Global Health and COVID-19. Ivan Bassato, Executive Vice President Operation of Aeroporti di Roma. So we are in Italy. In Rome, Thomas Reynaert, Managing Director of Airlines of Europe. Mr. Reynaert will talk about his role and the activity of his association. And last but not least, Gabriele Burgio, President and CEO of Alpi Tour Group. So it's one of the biggest Italian tour operator. Paola Testori Coggi, you have the floor. If I'm not wrong, we will talk about a very important and core issue, let's say the green digital certificate. You have more or less 7 minutes each of you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I will speak a little bit about health and then about the green digital certificate. First of all, about health, because I want to give you an idea of what will be the scenario of the pandemic at worldwide level. We know that the vast majority of people which are infected produce at least some antibodies and immune cells that can fight the pandemic, that can fight the disease, and the evidence suggests that the protection persists for many months. But there is a massive dynamic range in the response of the immune system with a 200-fold differences in the level of antibodies. This is unique for the coronavirus. So it's difficult to predict how strongly and for how long the protection in the infected people will last. Then for the vaccine, also, we do not know how long the protection will last, especially because we started to vaccinate it 6 months ago, so we'll have to see. But we know already that it will not, this vaccine will not give a lifelong protection, and it will last probably for many months, but not for years. So, and also, and in addition, the person which are immunized probably will be able to transmit, because to being immunized does not mean equal to zero transmission. Because if a vaccinated people get the virus in his throat, it will still be able to spread the virus even if he does not get sick. Then the vaccination campaign. We know that it is difficult to vaccinate billions of people because of the difficulty in production, the weak health system of great part of the world, the cost of producing vaccine and the cost of deployment vaccine, and also certain vaccine hesitancy. So we will not reach the herd immunity. So this we know. Then there are the variants. Considering that only a limited proportion of the world population will be vaccinated, the virus will continue to circulate amongst the unvaccinated people. And because the mission of the virus is to resist, the mission of the virus is finding host, to survive and to replicate. So the virus will mutate. And the vaccine will not work always against continuously emerging variants. So there will be a need to upgrade vaccine and to revaccinate people. So the most, now I arrive to the conclusion of this very negative scenario. The most probable future scenario is that COVID-19 will stay with us forever and will become an endemic, probably a seasonal recurrent infection. So there will be a need to vaccinate yearly the old people and the fragile people, and the citizens which will be able and which will be willing to pay will get vaccination. So with this scenario, it is clear that we have to think what to do about. The European Union now has made a very ambitious and comprehensive set of proposals for a new European Health Union. It's called European Health Union, with a series of new proposals, a new proposal for an agency like the BARDA, which will be able to develop, produce, and deploy vaccine, much more stringent coordination and integration of the health measures at the level of the member states. So there is a series. So we hope that if a new pandemic will appear, we will be able to effectively and rapidly react. But now the European Commission has also made an important proposal, which is the digital green certificate. The digital green certificate is not a precondition to travel, will not be a precondition to travel, will be an instrument to allow safe and free movement of citizens within the European Union. And it will be, on which basis? It will be a proof that a person has been vaccinated, has received a negative test results, or has recovered from an infection of COVID. The Commission has made a proposal mid-March, and now, the European Parliament and the Council are discussing. They are both under an accelerated procedure. So the trilogue, which is this trilogue is a final negotiation to find an agreement, will start quite soon. And the objective is to have the legal text adopted, in the course of the month of June. So, even better. Adopted by the end of May so that it can enter into force and can be formalized in June. But while the legal text is negotiated, there are work which has started since December at technical level to define the technical specification and the solution of the system. So how the system will work in practice. The member state, so the certificate will be issued at the level of the member state. the member state issuing the certificate to each person, will encode the data related to the person in a QR code, and then will sign this certificate. So the certificate will consist of two parts, a private part and a public part. It's called the key. The private key, which will only be available to the national authorities, which are issuing the certificate. And the public key, which is in fact the signature, which the member states is using to verify, the content. The Commission will build a central system, which is called Gateway, which will store the public keys used by the member states. So when a citizen shows, its passport, its certificate with a QR code, it is scanned. The digital signature by the member state is verified using the public keys which are stored in the central gateway, but the personal data will not be accessible. The personal data will stay at national level. So this is important. The only data which are passing through the European gateway are the public keys charged by the member state. There will be no central database at EU level, no personal data at the gateway level, no cross-border exchange of data. Now, this gateway, so this system, will be ready by early May. The member state will start to test during the month of May, so that at the beginning of June, when hopefully the legal test is adopted, we can start and apply. Also, the European Commission is supporting the member state to develop software that can be used to scan, the QR codes. And the European Commission is also developing, in an open source way, technical specification and digital green certificates that member states can use. So for the member states who are not able to develop, the European Commission is developing model. Another important issue is what the advisor TOSCHI said, the global interoperability. The Commission is working very closely with the WHO, because the WHO is developing a smart vaccination certificate to ensure that these systems are interoperable. And also, in the regulation, so in another parallel regulation, there is also provision which makes sure that if a third country has a system which is of comparable security, comparable authenticity, security, we will be able to recognize. And in which way? The third country certificate will be recognized by one member state, and automatically, if one member state recognizes, the third country certificate, this certificate is recognized by all the other 26 member states, so that the third country citizens will be able to move freely amongst the 27 member states. Now, an important point is, but what do we do now with the Schengen? Because we know, we are in the Schengen area where, the free movement of people, but, the Schengen at present is not working very well. The problem started when the member state, adopted a restriction for traveling from third countries, which were different at different times. So even now, there are a lot of restrictions from third countries. But the European Commission now considers that if there are restrictions for third countries, they have to be taken at European level, not at national level. And the European Commission has now sent infringement letters to all the member states who are not respecting, the Schengen area. So we hope that with this infringement letter, with the new digital green certificate, which will be adopted, to finally reestablish fully the Schengen area and the movement also of citizens from third countries which have a system which is of the same level. In conclusion, the European Commission has made a proposal for a new European Health Union which will enable the Europe to face future pandemic in an effective way. For the management of the present pandemic, we will have the digital green certificate which will be implemented by June. And as a final message, it is only with more integration of the 27 member states in health and in the related measures that we'll be able to fight off this pandemic and to avoid or manage future pandemics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Testori Coggi, for your introduction. Very interesting and stimulating issues, especially on the side of privacy, which is an issue when you talk about digital green certificate. More questions are coming on our chat. I remember that you can write using the Q&A tool at the bottom of the bar of the Zoom device. And now let's go to Rome. Ivan Bassat, Executive Vice President Operation of Aeroporti di Roma. So let's see the question from the ground, from the airport. Mr. Bassat, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Finucci. Good afternoon to all the participants to the webinar, to the distinguished panelists. Let me start by saying thank you to Istituto Affari Internazionali and to Boeing for organizing this, having organized this roundtable. I think it's of primary importance that we hold this kind of discussion a year, almost and a half into the pandemic, trying to identify a way out from this crisis, relying on the many experiences that we got on the field and the scientific evidence that we have gathered in the process. We absolutely need to restart lives and economies, and I think it's a great instrument that we can do that by the reactivation of travel and the air transport. I'm happy to bring the perspective of Aeroporti di Roma. We try to offer ideas and, as I said, lessons learned on the field for the discussion and for the policymakers. This year for us has clearly represented a year of many changes, a lot of first times in Rome Fiumicino, in Rome airports in general. We were the first ones at the very beginning to introduce thermal scanning, the first ones to limit the entrance of passengers, let us to the airport terminals only to passengers, first ones to test, COVID test a full flight of passengers, introduced large scale on-airport testing in an airport, creating drive-in testing facilities, creating the first pilot of a COVID tested flight on a domestic route, expanding that pilot internationally with flights from the United States. I will speak about those COVID tested flights in the technical presentations afterwards. First ones to create a large vaccination hub on an airport, testing and piloting also health applications beginning in 2021. So we try leading the industry, the airport industry and the air travel industry in identifying solutions to the new problems and to the new dramatic emerging problems of the pandemic. Of course, maximum focus on ensuring robust protocols for health safety, for protecting the health safety of the country and our communities, but on the same way and same time to create also the preconditions for the reactivation of air travel as we are striving to do in this period. Despite all these efforts, the current situation is bad. Air demand in Rome, in Italy, generally speaking in Europe, is at very low level. April 2021, minus 90%. So the crisis is still at the lower levels that we have experienced in a year and a half. This April, on an average, we had 13,000 passengers per day in Rome Fiumicino. In 2019, same period, April, average daily passengers 120,000. And I need to recall in this occasion that we have something like 1,500 companies, 1,500 companies working in the two airports, employing almost 30,000 workers. And this is just the direct impact of the crisis on air travel in the main airports of Italy. So the main reasons, of course, consumers' confidence is not back at the pre-pandemic levels. But at the same time, we still have massive blanket restrictions of states, member states, European Union member states. I'm particularly glad to hear that now the Commission is pushing for more harmonization, for more coordination, even with strong levers like infringement procedures. We have a system, especially in our country, of trust-based quarantines that are very difficult to enforce, are very difficult to control, but they are totally disincentivizing air travel. We have limitations still on motivations for travel. Only essential travel is allowed from many countries. General rule applicable to all passengers coming from non-European Union destinations. And then now we have also quarantines on intra-EU travel. So if these restrictions are widely adopted, the forecast for this summer cannot be positive. It is indeed quite gloomy. On the opposite side, we have the experience of airports like Fiumicino, where we, I would say, with the cooperation of the airlines and the health authorities, we always had an excellent cooperation on the field with the health authorities. We identified protocols, health protocols, like the COVID-tested flights, testing before departure, and in some cases also retesting right after disembarkation, which proved to be absolutely robust. We have tested more than 200,000 people in Rome Fiumicino in the last 7 months. We had numbers about a flow of 10,000 passengers, as I will show later on, from the United States, area that before, I would say, February this year, had numbers of new daily infections of more concern compared to Italy. Numbers that show that these protocols are capable to filter out infected individuals, and the population of air travelers is healthier than was originally estimated by the health authorities of the European Union. For sure, we are talking about 99.5%. In these corridors, 99.83% passengers that are actually healthy passengers. We should build on these models in Italy and in Europe, and somewhat we are trying to build on these models because clearly they are promoted as best cases in the industry. The European Digital Green Certificate, very positive, highly welcome initiative. But as my predecessor said, it is a common technical standard. It's part of the solution, is not the solution. It can be an enabler of the solutions, of the toolkit of new policies that we need to recover in a situation where the virus still circulates. And we will for many months or years, as we think. So the DGC as a common technical standards, the member states, Italy, should develop in these days the policies, the rules, the systems that will be needed to use the Digital Green Certificate. Last week, there was a very important publication, the European Center for Disease Control and Prevention, ECDC, interim guidance on the benefits of full vaccination. Let me textually quote that publication, which we find of paramount importance. From the executive summary of the publication, ECDC says, when fully vaccinated individuals meet other fully vaccinated individuals, physical distancing and the wearing of face masks can be relaxed. Point 2, when an unvaccinated individual meet fully vaccinated individuals, physical distancing and wearing of face masks can be relaxed if there are no risk factors for severe disease or lower vaccine effectiveness in anyone present. Point 3, very important for us, the air travel industry. requirements for testing and quarantine of travelers, if implemented, and the regular testing at workplaces can be waived or modified for fully vaccinated individuals, as long as there is no or very low level circulation of immune escape variants. So this is a very important opportunity again for the member states to harmonize their measures using the evidence, the scientific evidence and the scientific guidance provided by the European Center for Disease Control, medical evidence, scientific advice. There were such recommendations even in the past for other topics, but states did not react in an harmonized way, as we know. Finally, as an introductory remark on my side, a plea for the Italian government facing a possible partial limited recovery for the next summer season. We should ensure a level playing field in air travel, in aviation, in the Mediterranean, Southern Europe area. France, Spain, Greece, Croatia have all implemented pre-departure testing procedures that are very tight, like Italy did. But these countries have not implemented post-travel quarantines. If I look at the Eurocontrol data, the forecast for the next 6 weeks of air demand, so very reliable flights that have already been sold and will be certainly operated by the airlines. 6 weeks from now, by June 10th, by June 15, more or less, Greece will have a number of flights that is 75%, 3/4 of what they had before COVID 2 years ago. France will have 60% of those flights. Spain will have 55% of those flights, a little less than I expected. Italy will have 45% of those flights. I think that this gap is in the systems, so we are not able to avoid it in the next 6 weeks, but we should do our best. Full cooperations, transparent cooperations between the industry and the policymakers. I have to say that I was really impressed by the introductory speech of Councillor TOSCHI. We should do our best to create the conditions for a summer where also the operators in Italy will have the same chances of the operations within the union at least. So all the, I would say, the knowledge and all the experience are there. We identified in Rome, in Italy, excellent protocols, very safe, very robust. We should use them with a, I would say, timely change of policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bassato. I'm sure that Paolo Toschi, diplomatic advisor of Minister Garavaglia, will take note of your remarks and that they will be discussed in the G20 panel. Thomas Reynaert, Managing Director of Airlines of Europe, you have the floor for more or less 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Finucci, and also many thanks to the organizers of today's event, including also the Institute and Boeing, which is one of A4E's fervent supporters and active members. Maybe to start to say that it's quite clear, I think, for all of us that the crisis is far from over. From an airline's perspective, we even haven't started, you could say, with the recovery as yet. The crisis is far from over, of course, when you see that the numbers of infected are still very high across the EU. The good news is, compared to where we were a few months ago even, today we now have a path towards recovery, and I think it's been made quite clear from the previous speakers. The vaccination is accelerating. Testing capacity is improving across Europe. And it's in this context that the Digital Green Certificate, the DGC, will play a key role. It will play a key role, we believe, in restoring the freedom of movement across the European Union, and in turn also supporting Europe's economic recovery from the crisis, which is of course very important after all. At the moment, we are working as airlines, we're working very closely with the airports and with the European Commission on the technical specifications of the DGC, technical specifications, which I'm sure you can appreciate are needed for airlines to integrate these as part of the natural at-home check-in process for travelers, and to avoid airport queues and avoid unnecessary risks. But the Digital Green Certificate alone will not solve it all. It's not a silver bullet for our industry. On the one hand, we're of course encouraged to see that the legislative process, which was mentioned before, the legislative process with regards to the DGC being fast-tracked, is very good news. On the other hand, however, how fast the member states will actually implement the Digital Green Certificates or ensure that they are interoperable on a global scale still remains to be seen. It's something we all wish, we all want, but we will have to see practically what will happen in the field. And of course, we have 27 EU member states. It not only depends on the willingness and the preparedness and the support of Italy, but of course of all 27 member states. In addition, once the DGCs are implemented, the question is, how do we ensure the lifting of travel restrictions and a true coordination between member states? Lifting travel restrictions alone in itself is not enough. They need to happen in a coordinated fashion, something which so far, since the start of the crisis, we have not seen, either by introducing travel restrictions or partly lifting travel restrictions. There was never a good European coordination. So the question is, will there be also a review of the Council recommendations banning non-essential travel, for instance, as a result of the introduction of the DGC? And if so, when will we see that? And these are very important questions because the summer season is coming up. People would normally be booking their flights for the summer season, which they're not doing for the reasons I think which we've mentioned on the panel earlier. And the summer season is key for the airlines to survive, and is the most important season for tourism, but also of course for air travel. The fact is that airlines are ready to deliver safe travel, but we need governments to work with us to make this happen in a safe and harmonized manner. I cannot stress this sufficiently. The vaccination programs underway will further reduce the risk from COVID and give passengers additional confidence in the coming months, we hope. The restoring of the consumer confidence is of course key. It is probably, from an airline's perspective, the most important top priority in this crisis. Without consumer confidence, people will not fly, won't fly, they won't book air tickets, and they will stay at home. Right now, member states still have different testing and quarantine regimes in place, creating really an uncoordinated and unworkable and often distorted patchwork of national measures. A common approach to testing as well, based on harmonized interpretation of the ECDC, color map, would actually go a long way in supporting a sound restart. A4E, for that matter, has been calling for this coordinated approach, together with the airports, by the way, at the European level, not only in Brussels, but also at member state level, literally since the crisis of the start of the crisis, which is more than a year ago now. So we need member states to invest in the testing capacity to provide passengers with rapid and affordable antigen or saliva tests before traveling, before people get to the airport. And in this context, the quarantines should be a measure of last resort, really. We also urge, as A4E, we urge the member states to adhere once and for all to our harmonized traffic light system, not 27 different systems. Passengers want to travel again. I think many observers and many analysts have actually confirmed this the last couple of months. There is a huge pent-up demand, and recent polling including from IATA, has actually showed that passengers expect governments to find a way to make this happen. So we believe in a good way, and we hope that the public, the passenger, will continue to put the national governments under pressure so that they can start traveling again. Going forward, we actually expect travelers who have already been vaccinated or recovered from the virus to be exempt from all travel restrictions. This is really, I think, which should be the objective of or a result of the vaccination, if it's done in a continued and a very credible way. But we're still lacking the clarity on the easing of travel restrictions for vaccinated persons, despite recent ECDC guidance supporting this. ECDC was mentioned before, and it is encouraging, as Mr. Bassato has said, but ECDC is our only recommendations, together with the EASA recommendations, and we've seen in the past these recommendations are not always taken seriously, unfortunately, by member states. So I think I'd like to, for the sake of maybe having a discussion afterwards, I would like to stop here maybe as a first intervention. So thank you very much, Mr. Finucci, and thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reynaert from Airlines of Europe, Mr. Gabriele Burgio, President and CEO of Alpituro Group, which is one of the biggest European tour operator. Transports means, as you know very well, as everyone knows very well, tourism. And so you have the floor, Mr. Burgio, for more or less 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Finucci. Unfortunately, we are not the largest tour operator in Europe, but so far only in Italy, but we are working on...
I say one of the largest.
We are trying to get bigger.
Let me say.
Yeah. No, thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity. And when we were discussing the content of my intervention was, we thought that the most interesting part of what I could say is really how clients live this situation, how the market perceives all these limitations. I would say that we can divide the world on two big parts. Certainties, so regarding many aspects, some have been mentioned today, and then a certain trust by the consumers to travel. On the first part, I would say that we have experienced in the last 14 months an exaggerated amount of confusion. If you look at some vaccines were good below 60 years, then they were only good for over 60 years, then was better one brand and another brand. And I was mentioning before to a friend that when we get our normal flu vaccine every year, we don't know which is the brand. Now we are all becoming very experts in which brands we're using. And this creates a lot of uncertainty, because a lot of people really don't know what to think, whom to listen to, and what decisions to make. Another aspect that is creating a lot of confusion is the different procedures and mechanisms, even within the European market, to travel. We have seen in the beginning of the year, and also before, in late summer 2020, the decision between the UK and France, according to the freedom to travel. Then we have seen different rules, but completely different rules. For example, some countries in Europe, they ask for the antigenic test, others for the PCR tests. Others, they want the test 48 hours before, others, they want 70 hours before. And sometimes, even traveling from one country to the same country, so to go and come back, you have to do different procedures. This, again, creates confusion, not only on the people that have to eventually to pass the test, but also to a group like ours and all our colleagues in the same business, that we really don't know sometimes how the regulations have changed, and how and what to answer to these questions. And sometimes the access to information is not so easy. Last quarantine, we had a new one created in Italy from travel within European countries of five days. This solution came, this proposal came just before Easter, and we had an avalanche of cancellation by tourists, foreign tourists coming to Italy, because of course, if you travel to Italy for a week of holiday and you have to spend 5 days in closed in your hotel, I don't think is a very exciting holiday. So 5 days quarantine if you come to Italy from France, 0 quarantine if you go from Italy to Spain. So all these things we would hope, we people that work in tourism, we would have hoped to have the same, at least within the European system, to have the same rules. That would simplify a lot the way people can understand and eventually take their own decisions. The Green Pass would be welcome. We support that solution. We think that Green Pass is something can make things easier, can make decisions more certain. And we see also that in countries where the vaccines have very well being developed, like Israel and Great Britain, we see that the disposition by customers to travel and to value eventual holidays has increased a lot. On the other hand, we have a challenge altogether in the world of tourism. We have to understand how we can give some trust to the consumers. Of course, all the world of vaccines is something that can be again improved. We are firmly believers that the safety, although there are often studies that come against what I'm going to say, but we think that the safety within the planes with the HEPA filters and with the recirculation of the air is not an issue. And then also we have countries where the level of vaccination is such that the risks are very low. I picked today, just for the last minute, 4 statistics of people traveling. So the 87% of the customers traveling are worried about quarantine being imposed during their travel abroad, 87%. 82% are worried of the costs involved in taking the tests. 72% are worried that during the trip something can happen and the freedom of traveling between countries is going to be changed. And then something that we as tour operators or agencies or tour or people involved in tourism can fix is the worry that if the trip booked is cancelled, that they will eventually lose money. So that is only of the 4 worries that we can take care of ourselves, because now, for example, the bookings that we are selling are not subject to down payments, because it's pointless if the situation changes again to create all a big up and down of money to people that have booked, and then we have to give the money back. So we allow people to book without down payments. But the others, the risk of quarantine, the cost of the test, and the cancellation of the trip due to COVID is something that probably the regulators can take care of.
Mr. Burgio, congratulations for your timer. You are really, really, really on time.
You know, it's not, there is no secrets.
You are probably not the biggest tour operator, but by sure you are the most on time, most precise. Anyway, thank you, Paola Testori Coggi, Ivan Bassato, Thomas Reynaert, and Gabriele Burgio, but please stay tuned until the end of this webinar, because I know that there are some questions that everyone can make using the right tool at the bottom of the Zoom device. So the second part is more, how can I say, technical. is more technical. We have some slides, and I will start with Boeing, with Lindsay Jones, Associate Technical Fellow of Boeing, that we talk about their Confident Travel Initiative passenger screening model. So you have the floor, Mrs. Jones.
Thank you so much. I will share my screen and show some slides. So I'm going to tell you a little bit today about the Boeing Confident Travel Initiative passenger screening model. But first, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the probabilistic modeling effort in the Boeing Confident Travel Initiative. This has been one piece of the Boeing Confident Travel Initiative starting last year. In the early part of the modeling effort, we focused primarily on the airplane environment, looking at computational fluid dynamics, modeling of airflow in the cabin, and modeling the movement of particles when a passenger coughed. And this is the result that Ms. Angela Natale mentioned earlier about the result of sitting next to someone in an airplane cabin is equivalent in terms of particle exposure of sitting 7 or more feet away in something like an office conference room environment. In recent months, we have focused our modeling efforts outside the airplane. There is a model that we have been working on, looking at the end-to-end travel journey at the relative risk of different interventions and control measures and their relative effectiveness in the entire travel journey as a whole. But today, I will focus primarily on the passenger screening model. And this model is looking at comparing the effectiveness of different testing and screening strategies for international travel for the purposes of reopening international travel and preventing the translocation of disease during international travel. So the passenger screening model is a Monte Carlo simulation-based model where we simulate a group of 10,000 infected travelers. And the basis of that simulation is starts with the timeline, the infection timeline for each of those infected travelers. And so the typical infection timeline is represented by the top right graphic here on the screen, where a person is exposed to the virus and then has an incubation period that is slightly longer than typical respiratory diseases, which can be problematic because it can be difficult to detect a COVID-19 infection in the first few days after exposure. Usually a couple of days before the symptoms begin, the person becomes infectious and can infect others. And it's typically a period of about 8 to 10 days during which a person is contagious and can spread the infection. So after modeling the disease timeline and creating a disease timeline for each infected traveler, then we look at the relative performance of tests at different points in that infection timeline. So modeling the performance of tests as a function of the time from initial exposure. And so this graphic on the bottom right here is an idea of the performance of different tests as a function of the infection timeline. And in this particular graphic, time 0 represents the time of symptom onset. So the initial disease exposure happened approximately a week before that. So this is where the -1 begins here. And the curves displayed here are a black curve for RT-PCR-based tests, which are the gold standard of COVID-19 tests. These are laboratory-based tests that have to be sent off, and the results are not received for 24 to 48 hours typically. The other curve right below that in red is a rapid antigen test. And as others have mentioned today, these are the tests that can be done very quickly. The results are usually available within 15 to 30 minutes for many of these tests. And the performance can be quite good, not as good as the RT-PCR tests, but one of the advantages of the rapid antigen test, as you see here, the curve for the PCR-based test trails off quite slowly. So the detection probability is still quite high in the later stages of the disease, whereas the antigen test, that detection probability drops off more quickly. And one problem with RT-PCR test is that a person can still test positive even after they're no longer contagious. So that's one thing that we are keeping in mind in this modeling effort, even though we're not explicitly modeling that effect. The other test types that are shown here are antibody tests. There's two blue lines representing two different types of antibodies. And these are just for illustration purposes only. We have not modeled the performance of antibody tests because they are typically most useful for detecting past infections rather than detecting current infections. So in our model, as I mentioned, it is a Monte Carlo simulation-based model. So we simulate from a distribution different points of interest in the infection timeline. So these plots on the left display distributions of those events. The first event of key interest is the time of symptom onset. And that typically occurs about 5 days after the initial exposure. Although not everyone will develop symptoms, there will be some asymptomatic infections. We assume that the infection timelines are quite similar and that the time of the peak viral load for asymptomatic individuals is about the same as the time of symptom onset for those with symptomatic disease. We also model the end of the contagious period and look at a time of severe symptom onset for those who develop more severe symptoms and are considered too sick to travel. And so going on to the next piece, as I mentioned previously, the next piece is modeling the performance of the test as a function of that disease timeline. So the middle graphic here shows our modeling effort to look at the probability of detection or test sensitivity as a function of time. And this graphic here displays the test performance for a typical infection timeline. But one of the key parts of our model is, since we have a simulation-based model where every simulated infected individual has a unique disease timeline, the test performance is also unique. So these curves will differ for each simulated infected individual. And the peak of those curves, the peak of detection, will move around if the time to symptom onset moves around. And also as the length of the contagious period expands or decreases, the curves will also expand out or shrink in. So these functions are adaptive and their shape will change slightly for each simulated infected individual. From there, we use that to apply a set of testing protocols and to model the performance of those testing protocols. And we do that in terms of, we display those results in terms of prevalence. So this is the typical type of results that we're displaying. This is just a few example scenarios. And we start with passengers who are departing from an origin country that has a prevalence per 100,000 that's represented by the red bar on the left-hand side of this chart, and also by the top blue dotted line. So this is the starting prevalence for each of the travelers in our model. And the destination country is represented by the yellow bar in the middle of the chart and the bottom blue dotted line. So the goal is to use a specific screening or testing protocol to reduce that prevalence from the high prevalence from the origin country down below a level that is already there in the destination country. So these screening protocol models are the most useful for modeling scenarios of travel from a high prevalence location to a low prevalence location. So some of these scenarios represented in this set of results are some quarantine-based strategies. So if we look here, the second bar from the right is a 14-day quarantine with 100% compliance. So if everyone complies with a 14-day quarantine, it can be quite effective. However, as was mentioned earlier in some of the earlier presentations, compliance with quarantine can be quite difficult, and especially if that is a self-monitored quarantine, the compliance can in fact be quite low. So if we look back towards the left-hand side of the chart, we can see that the compliance, that the performance, of a 14-day quarantine with low compliance of a 25% or a 50% compliance is quite reduced in terms of the prevalence is much higher. It's closer to the starting value of the origin country for these low compliance quarantines. And for this particular example destination country, these quarantines with low compliance are not sufficient to reduce the prevalence below the prevalence of the destination country. So next we look at some testing-based strategies, and we first see a single RT-PCR test 72 hours pre-departure, which for this example reduces the prevalence just slightly below that of the destination country. And of course, that will depend on which destination country is of interest and what the prevalence is there. That will certainly not be true in all cases. However, it is more effective than a low compliance quarantine. And the only problem with a single pre-departure test is, as I mentioned previously, there's a few days right after initial exposure to the disease before a person is likely to test positive. So some of those early stage infections can be missed with just a single test, which is why several countries are opting for strategies with a pre-departure test followed by a short quarantine after arrival and a test at the end of that quarantine period. So if you see here some of those dual testing strategies, there's strategies shown here, some of the smaller green bars towards the middle for a 72-hour pre-departure PCR test, and then a 5-day and a 4-day, which are very similar in performance. Post-arrival quarantine with a test at the end of that short quarantine period. So as you can see, those short quarantine periods with tests at either end can be as effective or nearly as effective. They're similar in performance to a 14-day quarantine with 100% compliance. And then the far right bar here shows a similar strategy with a pre-departure test, but this strategy has a pre-departure test within 48 hours of departure rather than 72. So having a shorter window pre-departure for that pre-departure test is beneficial in getting that test as close to the departure time as possible. But of course, there are logistical challenges associated with a short window for receiving those test results. So the take-home messages here are that there's no risk-free protocol, even 14-day quarantines that are monitored and have high compliance. There are still potentially some escapes. They're not perfect, but there are screening protocols that are as effective as that 14-day quarantine with the high compliance. And there are many screening protocols that lower the risk to the destination country in terms of reducing the prevalence to a level that's below what is already there. And as I mentioned previously, screening is the most beneficial for travel from high prevalence countries to low prevalence countries. So the next steps in our modeling, where we're going from here, we're looking at, of course, there are many variants of interest right now, and we are looking at the effects of these variants and trying to incorporate that into our recommendations. While it's difficult to model simply because it's difficult to know what percentage of infections in a given country are due to which variant, and unfortunately there's not enough sequencing worldwide to understand what variants are present and to understand which variant is the cause of each infection, but it's something that we're trying to look at and trying to account for in our modeling efforts. The other major interest right now is looking at vaccinations and the effect of COVID-19 vaccinations, and has been mentioned previously, the effectiveness of protocols where vaccinated individuals are either exempt from testing and screening requirements or have reduced testing and screening requirements. And so we have just recently adapted our model so that we can model such scenarios and are beginning to get results for scenarios where vaccinated individuals are exempt from testing protocols. That is all that I have for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your presentation, Mrs. Jones. And now let me give the floor to Jeffrey Townsend, professor at Yale School of Public Health, who will present a study on COVID-19 quarantine in cooperation with EasyJet. You have the floor, Professor.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you, Ms. Jones, for that fantastic presentation, which sets me up very nicely to talk about the work that I'm going to talk about now. Can I just ask, let's see, I need to have, is this visible to everybody? The slides?
Yes.
Very good. So I'm going to talk about evaluating COVID-19 quarantine and testing strategies associated with international travel. And let me just start by mentioning that this is collaborative work with Chad Wells, Abhishek Pandey, Alison Gavani, and others at the Yale Center for Infectious Disease Modeling and Analysis at Yale. And I want to just say that it's a follow-up to some recently developed approaches that we published on the analytical calculation of post-quarantine transmission. So this relates quite closely to what you just heard about. Essentially, if you use things like the time course of infectivity of COVID-19 over the days post-infection and the diagnostic sensitivity of RT-PCR tests or antigen tests over time, this is an RT-PCR test in this particular diagram, then you can actually project what the probability of post-quarantine transmission of COVID-19 is. And so this is just a diagram showing that generally speaking, testing on exit from a quarantine, these two blue lines below, is a better approach, far more efficacious than no testing or testing just on entry to a quarantine. So this paper came out in January, and upon the paper's arrival, we were contacted by EasyJet, who engaged us to follow up on this publication to better understand the implications of quarantine and testing for international travel. It was recognized that substantial progress has been made in many countries to manage the COVID-19 pandemic. EasyJet recognized it's critical that international travel does not undermine the progress that's been made. And as a result, they concluded a risk-based approach needs to be implemented to allow travel in a safe way. To do so, there was a requirement for scientific modeling to develop such a process. Their objective in engaging us was to build on the findings in our paper to understand the optimal combinations of test and quarantine that could be used to manage risk, the impact of travel on a country's healthcare systems as measured by hospitalizations, and understanding the added risk that's posed by variants of concern and how to manage it. So the first point I want to make is very much aligned with what was just told to you, which is just that you can perform COVID-19 quarantine and particularly testing in order to minimize the transmission that occurs post-travel. In particular, if you have no quarantine, the estimate that we get is that you're going to expect a passenger who may have been transmitting before travel, but will also likely transmit after travel, to pass on the disease to an average of about 0.89 people with a R0 of 2.5, an approximate level of 2.5 individuals that they pass the disease on average if they don't isolate. If you have a 10-day quarantine, that drops dramatically. And just to blow that up and show you some other possibilities, if you have a 10-day quarantine, you can see here looking at different avenues of 10-day quarantine or 6 days with and without antigen tests or PCR tests, or even 3 days with an antigen test, so to speak. You can see that there are results that are encouraging in that they are much, much lower than no quarantine and no tests. So appropriately timed antigen testing is an effective tool and an inexpensive alternative to PCR testing. As you might imagine, the lower cost may encourage more people to opt for test to release, which performs actually better than, say, a 10-day quarantine. And shorter quarantines may also lead to higher compliance, as was discussed in some detail in the last presentation, and therefore could in fact be more effective in some circumstances in limiting COVID transmission. Of course, we need quarantines to be appropriate for the particular situation at hand, and so we continued this research examining the question of what's the potential of quarantine and testing to prevent additional in-country transmission of travel destinations. So I'm going to just tell you the bottom line here, what I'll tell you in the rest of the talk, which is that quarantine and testing regime sufficient to reduce in-country transmission to the same level could be achieved by that could be achieved by complete border closure can be calculated. In other words, there's a way to ask the question, does the quarantine and testing we're doing mean that we will have more or less transmission than the amount we'd expect, even if we close the borders? And that's because at this point in the pandemic, at least in Europe, all of countries have some level of transmission, and the quarantine and testing actually is a preventive measure, actually decreases the total amount of transmission. And so with the right quarantine and testing regimes, you should be able to find a way to achieve the same results that border closure could achieve. And among many European countries, I will tell you that regime is actually 0 days, but not all of them. And the vaccination, as we move forward, will also have tremendous public health benefit in terms of reducing in-country hospitalization, which is probably the greater decision-making criterion than transmission itself. So border quarantine and testing in the context of hospitalization provides a trivial reduction in comparison to ongoing vaccination. So as vaccination proceeds, we should anticipate that the danger from travel transmission should be less and should have less and less impact on in-country hospitalization. All right, so how can we do the kind of analysis that I just described? What we're doing is we're quantifying the quarantine and testing regimes to abrogate the effect of travel on in-country transmission. So if you just imagine these two circles as two countries, A and B, and consider travelers who are going from country A to country B and back from country B to country A and vice versa. Let's take the bottom example for just the purpose of this conversation. If country B has a higher rate of infections, and the blue dots represent not people, but actual infections occurring, then when they move to country A for travel, of course, they may lead to more infections occurring in country A than would individuals who are currently in country A who have a lower prevalence. And the ideal is maybe we could put in a quarantine that's sufficient to prevent that added infection. And if we can put it in a quarantine that's successful enough, or quarantine and testing regime that's successful enough to prevent the added infection, then travel in and of itself will not contribute to infection any more than border closure would. And it would seem, for all the socioeconomic reasons that we generally would like to have travel, that it would make sensible to just impose that quarantine and adopt travel. So these can be all quantified. I'm not, of course, going to go through the mathematics here. I just want to mention that basically there's a certain amount of transmissions happening in country. Each one of these groups of people traveling at the rate that they travel provides a certain amount of infection as well. And the bottom line is that as long as we can make sure that the border closure situation, where nobody is traveling and transmission is only according to the prevalence in country, is a greater or equal to the amount under travel, then it would seem that the quarantine could be sufficient. And so just to move on, I want to mention that this does involve a number of parameters and is a fairly sophisticated calculation. And these are the parameters. I'm not going to go through them one by one, but the important point that I want to make is just that we've derived these from authoritative sources, the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington, and Tormi was the source of a lot of our population and travel information. And also we used our world in data to get up-to-date values for the proportion of population immune to infection through vaccination or recovery. Now, the EU has specified simplified traffic lights criteria to determine tiers of risk that doesn't involve all those parameters I just mentioned. And it's just based on the prevalence for the most part, with another testing qualification, which is just to make sure that you have sufficient testing to know the prevalence. And so the categories are dark red, red, amber, and green based on these levels of new cases over the last 14 days. So I'm going to keep referring to those categories because they're familiar to policymakers in the European context. And I just want to mention that all of the data I'm going to show you is as of 12 April 2021, which is the most recent data set we could get as of Friday. And what we're looking at here is a map of Europe, where hatched countries are those where I don't have enough sufficient information to actually make a projection, but where any white or burgundy color countries are actually projecting the level of quarantine necessary to prevent additional in-country transmission. And it turns out for a country such as Hungary, which has a very high level of prevalence, or relatively high level of prevalence, and is in the dark red as of April 12th, 0 days of quarantine are sufficient for all travelers from 17 European countries. In other words, from Hungary's perspective, bringing travelers in will not increase transmission, even in this case without any tests at all. And so if we look at another example, Belgium, there is slightly more variation. 0 days of quarantine are sufficient for many travelers, but there are a few nations from which it would be necessary to have a quarantine and some testing to ensure that the amount of transmission within Belgium is not elevated by the action of travel compared to a complete border closure situation. On the left here, I'm just showing you that the median, which is 0, the median across these European countries we've looked at, there are 31 in the data set, but not every one of them is exemplified in every one of these plots. So 0 is the median amount of days necessary, 0 is the lowest end of the range, and 3 is the highest end of the range in terms of quarantine. So the quarantines that are necessary in this red country are fairly short for those countries that, that transmit in order to maintain this sufficient level of quarantine and testing. Now, some examples are a little more extreme. So if we take, as we go to the countries that have actually lower levels of prevalence, of course, there's a greater need for prevention in order to stop there to be any more transmission. We look at the UK, for instance, it was amber as of April 12th, and 0 days of quarantine are sufficient for some travelers into the UK. A median of 3 is sufficient among this set, and 5 is the upper limit to the European countries that we analyzed in this data set. Looking at some country pairs, we pair up Hungary and Cyprus on the right. They are very different, even though they're both dark red. And the reason for that is that Cyprus, of course, is a smaller country with a higher level of visiting than it has of visiting other countries. The consequence is that the net import of infections tends to be quite high, even if it's in a dark red and high prevalence state here. So there is more to this than just the prevalence in terms of understanding whether or not a country is receiving or not more infections, and that is why that sort of more parameterized model that we're using here gives you a sort of a detailed answer for every country. All right, moving on to red countries. We already talked about Belgium. I'll just give you the example of Italy here, this being hosted in Italy, and comparing Belgium and Italy. Italy is essentially the same, also has a median of 0 days travel for not increasing the total level of infections occurring in country, but it also has a slightly higher limit of 4, probably because, again, of higher levels of travel to Italy from other countries than vice versa. And then at the most stringent level, in countries that have the lowest prevalence, you can see that there is a quarantine for most other countries in the UK and in Portugal. And overall, there's a range from 0 to 5 and a median of 3 in the UK, as I mentioned earlier, and a range from 0 to 7 with a median of 4 in Portugal, largely due to Portugal's low prevalence, but also it has less travel than the UK out from the UK in general. All right, so that gives you a summary of what it looks like. Here is a table giving you basically every country for which we have data compared to every other country. And I just want to emphasize the number of countries for which travel could have essentially 0 quarantine, and it would not increase the net transmission within country. These are calculated with a single RT-PCR test. I'll talk a little bit more about RT-PCR and antigen tests. They've already been talked about some later. But even in the more extreme cases of amber versus dark red countries, if the destination country is shown on the left here, is in the amber territory and the origin country is in dark red, the highest travel quarantines that we see justified on the basis of preventing in-country transmission are around 5 to 7 days. I just want to emphasize that we also looked at how much hospitalization occurs comparing a 0-day quarantine with RT-PCR test to a 14-day quarantine with test. And you can see that the amount of hospitalization in terms of percentage is quite small for most of these origin and destination countries. So that implies that in many cases, decision makers need to think about the degree to which the prevention of travel is altering the hospitalization in country. Nearly every single one of these is a below 1% difference in the total amount of hospitalization seen in country due to travel on the short-term scale. So now let me just quantify one other thing, which is that in addition to quantifying these regimes for the general transmission of COVID-19, which of course is happening fairly widespread across the entire globe and all of Europe. But one of the major concerns right now are these variants of concern. We can do exactly the same framework where what we just do is look at the transmission of the variants of concern without regard or with also regard to non-variants of concern. And so we can use exactly the same framework to ask with variant of concern, what are the expected quarantines that we need to prevent additional transmission of that variant in country compared to the transmission that's happening already in the country. And when we parameterize our model to quantify sufficient duration of quarantine solely for variant of concern B117, you can see that it's a smaller data set because of the issues of obtaining data about the prevalence in different countries. But looking across this data set, you can see it's a similar pattern to what we showed earlier with regard to the differences between individual countries and how much quarantine is necessary to be sufficient to equalize transmission with or without travel. Now, there's a few exceptions to that. One is Turkey, you can see here, which has a very high asymmetry of travel and also a low level of B117 at this point. And so for that reason, it has very high levels of quarantine. Just to assure you, you can of course get those whenever there's a very big difference in frequency. And to assure you more of that, look at the results when we look at variant of concern 501Y-V2. Now here you can see it's pretty different in terms of which countries need to be concerned and which not. And that's because there's a lot more heterogeneity. That variant is at low frequency in general and at very different frequencies in different countries because essentially it's at low frequency and hasn't spread as much. And that means that different countries are going to have different optimal quarantines with regard to creating the sufficient duration of quarantine in order to prevent 501Y-V2. And in general, as you go down to lower frequency variants, you're going to find more and more imposition of quarantine as you sort of get back to the situation of completely trying to stop that variant from entering your country. But that also means that one has to be especially careful in decision-making, that one should be sure that a variant is truly of concern if one is going to impose quarantines in order to prevent that kind of imposition. So let's just move on to the next part that I want to mention, which is that can our highly parameterized model be simplified? It may be difficult to implement a highly parameterized model with very different results for different countries within practice in terms of travel. And the answer is yes, it can, with some, of course, loss of information. In particular, let's just adapt ourselves as directly as we can to that EU traffic light system. What essentially we did is take the average of every other parameter for all of Europe and then use the actual prevalence as dark red, red, amber, or green for each country and calculate what the anticipated sufficient duration of quarantine would be. Here is the result for generalized transmission. Tier-based analysis like this yields sufficient quarantines with RT-PCR and exit that range from 0 to 6 days in the worst case scenario. If you look at the form of this, of course, the median is in fact 0 again in terms of the number of days of quarantine necessary, ranges up to 6 or so. Now, just to emphasize the points about the antigen tests, if we look at an antigen test on exit, it's nearly equivalent. The only change between these two slides is in the green dark red corner up in the upper right here, which goes from 6 to 7 days of quarantine. And if you apply a dual antigen test on entry and exit, that gives it equivalency to the RT-PCR test. Now, the last point that I want to make is that the projected effect of vaccination on hospitalization under very conservative assumptions is quite remarkable. So if you look at the hospitalization rate with 0%, which is already passed now. Of course, we're in Europe and in all countries, essentially, there's prioritization towards the age structure, which means that the initial vaccination has even better effect than later vaccination, but all vaccination is quite helpful. And the projected effect of vaccination on hospitalization is quite good. I'm saying this is very conservative assumptions because the way we calculated this curve was assuming that the vaccination does not actually stop transmission at all and only provides its benefit with regard to hospitalization. So the point is that as vaccination helps, this coverage should encourage people to feel safer traveling. And just to make the point really clear of the relatively small impact of quarantine and testing, what I've done here is just blow up the 25 to 30% vaccine coverage in destination country x-axis. And I'm showing you the difference between the total amount of hospitalization from a 0-day quarantine, a 6-day quarantine in the blue here, and a 14-day quarantine in the green here. And what you can see is, in fact, going from 0 to 6 in the black to 14 is a very, very small effect compared to the net effect of vaccination on hospitalization. So certainly our efforts should be devoted wholly, if we can, towards vaccination over many other public health interventions, but especially things like the quarantine of travelers between two countries that already have high levels of prevalence or reasonably high levels of prevalence. All right, I want to make one point to consider before I just wrap up, and that is that this analysis could, of course, be applied at all geographic scales. The utility of quarantine and testing associated with travel operates not only at the level of the country, but within any population division, such as the province, the metropolis, the town, the community, even the household. And you can use the same framework to calculate, what level of motion you might want. The heterogeneity in disease prevalence also occurs at all scales, and therefore, I just want to emphasize that our calculation that international travel between specific countries does not require a quarantine in many cases does not imply that no controls on travel are worthwhile within countries, because every prevalence difference deserves its own attention. Let me summarize my conclusions here, which are that a quarantine and testing regime sufficient to reduce in-country transmission to the same level that would be achieved by border closure can be calculated. In almost half of European country pairs in current times, this regime is 0 with no test. In a majority of them, this regime is 0 days with an RT-PCR or an antigen test. The same framework can be applied to determine quarantine and testing regimes sufficient to reduce in-country variant of concern transmission. Be aware that variants typically have a more geographically localized distribution, leading to longer quarantines to protect against net import. Vaccination will have tremendous public health benefit in terms of reducing in-country hospitalization, and it should be understood that border quarantine and testing provides a trivial reduction in hospitalization in comparison to ongoing vaccination. Thanks for your time and listening. I want to thank EasyJet for the support to actually conduct this research, and IAI and Boeing for the opportunity to present today.
Thank you, Professor Townsend. I'm sure, can you see me? Here we are. Thank you, Professor Townsend. I'm sure that the G20 staff will take into account your figures, your study. Very, very interesting, and I must say quite complicated, but it's really a huge study, So let's go back to Rome. Ivan Bassato, Executive Vice President Operations of Aeroporti di Roma. Mr. Bassato will show us some results of a study conducted in the main Italian airport.
Thank you again, Mr. Finucci. I hope you can see the presentation on top. The presentation is actually about the experience of Aeroporti di Roma with the so-called COVID-tested flights. We think it's a key, this protocol, to safely restart air travel and tourism. And we tested that on the field in the airport starting right before Christmas last year. Okay, so the agenda of the presentation. I will provide some quick data about the impact of the crisis on ADR and the industry, just the main numbers, the main figures. I will then focus on the COVID-tested flights. We'll explain what the protocol is about and how we think this protocol will be beneficial for the reactivation of air travel. And then we will see what the next steps, next weeks, next months, we think that they could be. The impact on ADR and the airport industry of COVID-19. Very well summarized on the chart on the left. Rome airports had in 2019 roughly 50 million passengers, mainly concentrated in Rome Fiumicino, but also 6 million in Rome Ciampino. A year later, we were back to the 60s when we opened Rome Fiumicino Airport, 11.5 million, a drop of 77% of the total number of passengers. But if we look at these days, the first part of 2021, actually the drop is even more, it's 90%, because last year we had the January and February, they were still quite normal during the first weeks of the emerging crisis. So minus 90% nowadays, but a forecast that we believe will take us to the pre-pandemic numbers only by 2025 or 2026. Last year for Aeroporti di Roma, impact on our company implied a loss of turnover of 760 million euros. We experienced pre-tax losses in 2020 of almost 200 million euros. We had to slow down the investments, even though we invested more than 100 million euros in 2020. And we had 3,000 employees on furlough scheme. Still, many of them are on furlough and they are not working within the company. If we look at the direct impact on the airport communities of companies and workers, as I said in the introduction, in Fiumicino and Ciampino, we have almost 1,500 companies active. They employ almost 30,000 employees, and many of them are still on standstill. Some figures from ACI Europe, the global impact in terms of loss of revenues for airports only, 30 billion in 2020. We estimate another 29 billion in 2021. Let's have a look at a case study, the most important long-haul market of Fiumicino, North America. So before COVID, North America accounted for more than 3 million passengers per year, 3.4 million passengers to be accurate. Mainly 80% of those passengers flying from or to the United States, to Rome, but also remarkably 600,000 Canadians. It's important to highlight that 80%, 4/5 of this traffic were made of persons traveling for leisure reasons. When we say restrictions are affecting the recovery because leisure traffic is not allowed, non-essential travel is not allowed, very bad definition, non-essential travel, all reasons for traveling actually can be seen as essential by the people that need to travel. We are saying exactly this, 80% of the market is out of play. And we have to remember that Rome and Italy are mainly incoming markets, with some outgoing to certain selected destinations like New York City. We are operating together with Alitalia and Delta Airlines COVID test routes quarantine-free for a few months so far. We actually have some traffic from the United States to Rome Fiumicino, but look at the comparison. April 2019, passengers from the United States were 240,000 almost, with a very high load factor, very good market, very profitable operations for many airlines looking at the Italian market opportunities, 86%. Now, this traffic dropped to 7,383 passengers with a load factor less than 20%. Clearly, this cannot be a sustainable commercial operation for any airline in the world. Passenger traffic lower by 97% compared to the same month 2 years ago. So very low load factors, very low number of connections still active. We think that traffic will eventually restart, but we do agree that there will be a long phase of coexistence with the virus. Vaccine campaigns are being rolled out in Europe, in Italy. We know that herd immunity, if ever, but if we look at the reports of the medical institutions and what our government says, the latest forecast is that we will be able to reach herd immunity somewhere after the summer season, let's say Q4 2021. So herd immunity is not likely to rapidly allow a complete eradication of the infection. Infection will stay. It might become an endemic virus, as it was said by prominent speakers in the introduction. So we think we will need travel protocols based on pre-flight screening. We need those protocols now at the peak of the crisis, at the maximum impact on traffic, but we will need those protocols even in the months and the years to come to support the resumption of air traffic in safety and without restrictions. Let's have a look at the protocol that we implemented in Rome Fiumicino. We said COVID-tested flights. A bit of context. Air travel per se is safe. It's almost 1.5 years since the start of the pandemic, and no major outbreaks were reported due to procedural gaps in the air travel industry, in the air transport, nor due to the failure to comply with the rules. So air transport was, together with the authorities, the competent authorities, aeronautical and health authorities, was really quick to identify and implement in weeks all the prevention measures that made sense from the epidemiological point of view. There is a minimal risk of infection, as it was well said by the previous speakers. All the modeling, but also the field experience, show that the risk of inboard infection is minimal when barriers are in place. There is a high degree of control and traceability in air transport. No other transportation means actually can prove to be as accurate as air transport in tracing contacts of people potentially exposed to transmissible diseases. So no surprise that after the first few months where we actually set up and implemented all the prevention barriers, the focus of the states is on avoiding import and export of infection across regions. As I said in the introduction, the main instruments are the so-called trust-based quarantines, which is, again, very difficult to enforce on 100% of the people that are subjected to this measure. And they prove these quarantines and these limitations to essential travel only, they prove not to be effective to stop the variants of concern and prohibit and prevent those variants to spread across the globe. So these travel protocols based on pre-departure testing remain the focus of the air travel, air transport industry, and can prove very, very, very viable in the next phases of the management of the pandemic, management of the crisis. I will not go through all these milestones. COVID tested flights actually is a model, a protocol that we, together with the local health authorities of Region Lazio and the national health authorities, Ministero della Salute and the Civil Aviation Authority, we identified these protocols as a viable option at the end of summer 2020, when it was clear that we could use a large capacity available at the airport to test passengers, and not only passengers actually. Just a long story cut short, In November last year, the Italian government issued a decree authorizing the pilot of a first transoceanic COVID-tested corridor to be operated between Atlanta and Rome Fiumicino and between New York City and Rome Fiumicino, which traded trust-based quarantine on arrival for a double negativity control test of 100% of the passengers. At that time, it was quite innovative because we proved that it could be integrated in airport and airline operational processes. So the protocol requires molecular or antigenic tests to take place 48 hours maximum before boarding. And we repeat at the airport upon arrival of the passenger, the test by using a rapid antigenic screening tool, 100% of the passengers. We started in December before Christmas, and by today, we actually handled 10,000 passengers arrived with this kind of protocol on board of these flights and exempted from quarantine. More routes are coming, still from New York City and Atlanta, as they are the only destinations approved by our government currently. It became a reference benchmark worldwide because the United Nations World Tourism Organization approved it to overcome the crisis of the aviation sector. And it is also a model for our member states because it had indeed a lot of resonance within ACI Europe and within the community of the air transport operators in our continents. It is true that in early 2021, almost all European Union member states finally switched to pre-departure testing, and in many cases, rapid pre-departure testing as a travel condition, still in an uncoordinated manner. The numbers. After the opening of these COVID-tested corridors, safe corridors, we had an actual increase of passengers because passengers were attracted, those that were eligible to travel, because the corridor model did not waive the limitation, the restriction on essential travel, which stays. But those that were eligible for traveling decided to travel to Italy via Rome because there was no quarantine connected to the double test scheme. What we observed on the field. So the presentations before of the speakers, of the previous speakers, were, I would say, very interesting also to set the stage for presenting some data on the field. Very accurate model, very interesting, but modeling. These are field data. We had, as I said, by April 11th, 2021, more than 200 flights that arrived with this protocol from the United States. We had to bear in mind that the United States in the first 3 months of this protocol were a country with a higher prevalence versus Italy. We had, I said, almost 10,000 passengers. 35 of these passengers tested positive at antigen test. So we should define those passengers suspect cases in Fiumicino. But after the protocol, of course, foresees a second level of testing if there is a positivity at antigen test at the first level. 13 passengers out of almost 10,000 passengers, 13 passengers actually were confirmed as positive cases at molecular testing. So it means that the virus prevalence of people arriving in Fiumicino after the more laboratory testing was in the region of 0.13%, 1.3 passengers every 1,000. Of course, there might be the possibility that some passengers tested positive after transiting at the airport. We investigated together with the local authorities the database of the positive cases, obviously respecting the privacy regulations to COVID. And we found very limited evidence, less than 13 cases, much less, of people that actually tested positive in the 14 days after the entrance in Italy with these flights. So overall, a very good performance in terms of protecting the local communities from the risk of importing the infection to Italy. So excellent results in terms of risk minimization, operational effectiveness, all checks carried out in less than 2 hours here at the airport, right after disembarkation, right after the deboarding gate, and passenger satisfaction in the region of 90 to 100% of the people that would recommend actually to travel aboard these flights. So next steps, we think that this experience should be replicated and should be extended to other countries, to flights connecting other countries outside the European Union to Rome and Italy, where there are no variants of concern. This is a very good tool that proved to be successfully tested on the field. There is another point of very relevant. There's an aspect that we should also take into growing consideration. We are interviewing the passengers that arrive to Rome Fiumicino about their vaccination status. We are asking passengers, are you vaccinated? And not surprisingly, considering the speed of the vaccination campaign in the United States and recommendations given by the Center for Disease Control in the United States, more than 50%, 52% to be accurate, this is the latest data available, of passengers arriving on board these flights have completed their vaccination course. And if we consider also the passengers declaring that they received just the first shot, it's almost 60% of passengers that are actually gone through a vaccination cycle. So the activation of a more extensive scheme of travel protocols based on pre-departure testing is something that we would like to see in place. The removal of trust-based quarantines, which seem, it's probably the 5th time that I said that, but they seem, but this is really the central point, they seem to be effective on paper, but they are not in the reality. We had people arriving from Brazil that did not, this was reported in a newspaper, that did not isolate properly. Self-isolation is not enforceable, and it is very disproportionate for healthy passengers, and air travelers are almost exclusively healthy passengers, and the removal of the essential travel reasons constraint, we hope in view of the 2021 summer season. As I said in the introduction, very important document from the ECDC. I want to re-quote the executive summary of what the ECDC wrote in that report last week. Requirements for testing and quarantines of travelers, if implemented, and the regular testing at workplaces can be waived or modified for fully vaccinated individuals. We are working very intensively on digitalization of processes. I will not go through all these informations, but again, in the last months, we extensively and widely looked into all the technological possibilities offered by the IT platforms, digital solutions for the management of all the documentation related to the COVID-19 processes. The first year of the pandemic was managed through paper copies. We cannot afford that for the recovery phase. So we offer our authorities, and there is an intense discussion to this extent, we offer our authorities to implement fully integrated platforms that can transpose on electronically the paper processes, that we are offering on airport testing in cooperation with the Istituto Spallanzani here at Rome Fiumicino airports. Antigen test, this is no publicity, but we are offering, I heard that passengers are concerned about the cost for testing. It's not the case of Rome. We are offering antigen test by a very renowned scientific institution at 20 euros each to passengers, with the possibility to book the test and do the test in the airport. And also, we are offering to passengers that do not want to test at the airport, because this is not the business of the airports and the airlines. We have to offer these options to have the processes working at the airport, but we are also advising the passengers and the people where they can take their labs testing if they prefer to do it off airport, as we would like to have. One final point, I also heard about the possibility that the post-pandemic phase or the recovery phase will see the implementation. We want to be a forerunner in that field, the implementation of biometric technologies, no-touch technologies, seamless travel models is really an area that we are looking at with a lot of efforts. We are in the position to announce that next July we will start a pilot of the first one in Europe of offering a COVID-tested intercontinental flight to passengers in combination with a no-touch biometric technology for check-in and boarding. So we are trying to combine the top experience of health safety to the top experience of facilitation and seamless travel to the passengers traveling via Rome Fiumicino Airport. Finally, Aeroporti di Roma advocates for a safe air corridors for tourism to relaunch intercontinental traffic flow. We think that the model of the COVID-tested flights, even in a situation where the vaccine campaigns are being rolled out by the states, but the model of the COVID-tested flights protocol will be very important, a key model to have a safe recovery of air travel, to replace, to trade for this new model for the self-trusted quarantine obligations, which proved not to be functional and working well. Within the European Union, we think that only testing before departure 100% of passengers should be performed. From outside the European Union, the testing before departure and after arrival could be the way forward to ensuring the maximum levels of safety. Travel should be open to all reasons. We have the protocol to have tourists safely flying. Again, we should connect Italy with low-risk countries with this model, and we, most of all, we should make extensive use of digital tools like the DGC, and but properly integrated in our processes, which are more complex than that, as I said in introduction. Finally, again, the EU Green Pass is exclusively a common technical standard. We think that the states, and we have the hope that our state, Italy, is developing rules and systems to have the citizens of the EU and the citizens of Italy to use the Green Pass in an effective and safe way. This is what we would like to see from the field in place for the next summer season. And in any case, we will need it in the future. Thank you for offering the possibility to speak at this webinar. And again, we are here to, I would say, to see these developments coming in as quick as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Bassato, for sharing with us your best practices. I think that G20 staff took note of your best practice. We are running out of time, so we have room only for 2 questions. The first is from Mr. Maurizio Fantato to Mrs. Coggi. I will make it short. It's a comparison between the vaccine and the digital green certificate. In a nutshell, the question is, how are governments going to ensure that there is a simple, straightforward, harmonized communication on this issue? I repeated the digital green certificate, precisely to avoid the issues experienced with the vaccine. Please, you have 1.5 minutes for your answer, so be short.
Yes. The failure of the communication for the vaccination campaign was due to the fact that the member states were interested to shift the blame of the failure of their vaccination campaign to the EU. So there was an interest of the member state to give all the blame to the European Union. Why? So this is the reason why it was a disaster, because the blame was not of the European Union. Now, it is a common interest for every member state to have the green digital certificate to work. So I'm sure that all the member states will communicate proactively and positively on this certificate. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So the second question is from Mr. Daniele Bosi to Thomas Reynaert, and the question is quite short. Is anyone considering to vaccine crew community as a priority, and crew means pilots and flight attendants?
Yes, thanks for the question. Very good question. It seems to be an obvious one for governments to prioritize vaccination for transport workers, including aviation workers, both crew and mechanics, both for airlines and airports. A4E wrote to the European Commission and EASA, European Safety Agency, in January of this year. Unfortunately, well, the positive thing is that the European Commission responded positively, so they fully agreed with us as well as EASA. However, if we just do a fast forward and check what the situation is today, first of all, the European Commission, together with us, is very frustrated to see that none of the member states, maybe France, but none of the member states today have actually formally prioritized vaccination for aviation workers. And the explanation is a standard one, that there is not sufficient vaccines available, and that hence the focus for the vaccination is age-related rather than sector-specific related. It does pose a problem also for the fact that third countries like Singapore and UAE actually have taken steps to prioritize vaccination of the crew. So you could even say that when the market recovers, is that European airlines in this case would have a competitive disadvantage with regards to those third countries that are taking care of or prioritization in terms of vaccination for the aviation staff. It's quite incomprehensible in our view that the European Commission, the member states who are favoring some segments of the population, of professional population, for early vaccination, and they do not do this with aviation staff, and in particular crew, pilots, and ground-based staff.
Thanks very much, Mr. Thomas Reynaert from Airlines of Europe. So we leave this webinar with so many information, and as I said before, I'm sure that the staff of the G20 Italian presidency will take into account our paper, your papers, your figures, your data. So thanks very much, everybody. All of you that spent almost 2 hours with us on the future of airlines, or the future of tourism and transport in Europe. So what can I say? Thanks, everybody, and of course, good luck for the future of transport and tourism. Thanks very much.